The forest stood silent, blanketed in the heavy shadow of a stormy night. The air crackled with electricity, the wind howled through the trees, and every instinct in me screamed to turn back. But I didn't listen. I had always cherished my grandparents' old cabin deep in these woods. Years had passed since I'd last been there, and I thought a weekend escape might be just what I needed. I wanted to rekindle the warmth of childhood memories, away from the relentless clamor of the city. But the cabin wasn't the same anymore. It stood there, worn and forgotten, much like the memories it held. I had no idea that something else had taken up residence in the place I once called home. Arriving by afternoon, after a grueling drive and hike, the cabin's once inviting aura seemed off. The familiar charm was there, the fireplace where we roasted marshmallows, the kitchen where Grandpa flipped pancakes with a smile, but something felt different. Still, I convinced myself it was just nostalgia playing tricks on me. As night crept in, the atmosphere grew colder, heavier. I lit a fire, had a modest dinner, and decided to settle in my grandparents' old bedroom. The moment I stepped inside, I could feel it, a strange chill. There, on the nightstand, a photo of them, smiling and in love, stared back at me. I longed for their presence, but that wasn't the company I'd have tonight. I slid under the covers, trying to shake off the growing sense of unease. Sleep wouldn't come. Restlessness turned into dread as I felt an invisible gaze burning into me from the darkness. Every creak of the cabin made my heart race faster. And then, I heard it. A whisper. My name. I shot up in bed, wide-eyed and terrified. There was no one there. Just the oppressive silence, yet I felt something sinister in the room. The whisper came again, louder, angrier, like venom dripping from unseen lips. This is my cabin. You don't belong here. A chill shot down my spine. The voice, it wasn't my grandmother's. It was darker, twisted with fury and resentment. You took everything from me. You destroyed my life. You have to pay. Suddenly, I knew who it was. My grandpa's first wife, the one who had died tragically before he met my grandmother. The one who was buried in the woods, never leaving this place. Panic gripped me as I tried to move, but I was frozen. The room turned ice cold, and a suffocating pressure weighed down on my chest. I couldn't breathe, couldn't scream. And then I felt them, cold, skeletal hands wrapping around my throat, squeezing tighter, tighter. Just when I thought my life would slip away, everything stopped. The pressure lifted, the icy grip vanished. Gasping for air, I heard a deep, commanding voice, a man's voice. Run. Without hesitation, I bolted out of the room, my heart pounding in my chest. I didn't stop to gather my things. I didn't look back. The darkness outside seemed safer than the evil within those walls. I sped to my car, my hands trembling as I fumbled with the keys. The engine roared to life, and I raced down the dirt road, the cabin shrinking in my rearview mirror. I drove for miles until I reached a small town, where I checked into a dingy motel, shaken to my core. I called my parents, desperate for someone to believe what had happened. They listened, but nothing could soothe the horror that still clawed at me. That night has haunted me ever since. I've never returned to that cabin, though I feel its pull. There are questions that need answers, secrets buried with the past. One day, I will go back. Not because I want to, but because I have to. The truth waits for me, hidden in the shadows. Months passed, but the memories of that night clung to me like a shadow I couldn't shake. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw those glowing, hateful eyes. I felt the icy grip on my throat. But something else gnawed at me, deeper than fear, curiosity. What really happened that night? Why did she attack me? And why did my grandfather's voice tell me to run? I couldn't let it go. After months of restless nights and research, I found something in my family's old records. A yellowed letter, written in my grandfather's handwriting, addressed to my grandmother but never sent. In it, he mentioned his first wife, Lillian, in cryptic terms: regret, sorrow, guilt. He hinted at something dark, something he had never spoken of. A secret buried with her. The letter ended abruptly, as though he couldn't bring himself to finish. It was all the confirmation I needed. There was something more to her death, something my family had kept hidden. I had to go back to the cabin. On a cold autumn afternoon, I returned to the woods, the trees now draped in the colors of decay. The wind seemed to whisper warnings as I approached the cabin. It looked even more decrepit than before, as if it had sunk further into its own misery. I stepped onto the porch, feeling the weight of history pressing down on me. As I crossed the threshold, the air felt heavy again, just like that night. The fireplace was cold, the dust thick, but the energy was alive. I stood in the center of the cabin, listening, waiting. I spoke aloud, my voice trembling but determined. "Lillian. I know you're here. I've come to find out the truth." The silence was deafening. Then, the temperature dropped. A gust of wind slammed the door shut behind me. The lights flickered, and in the dim glow, I saw her, an apparition of a woman, her face twisted with rage, her eyes glowing with the same hate I'd felt that night. "You shouldn't have come back," she hissed, her voice echoing like it was coming from everywhere at once. "I need to know the truth," I said, my voice stronger than I felt. "What happened to you? Why are you still here?" Her face flickered with something. Was it sorrow? Betrayal? For a moment, the rage seemed to lift, and the cabin around me grew quieter, as if she was deciding whether to speak. "He lied to me," she said finally, her voice trembling with old grief. "He promised me everything, and then he took it away. He left me here, to die." I felt a cold shiver run through me. "What do you mean? How did he leave you?" "He didn't love me anymore," she whispered, her figure flickering like a dying flame. "He found her, your grandmother. He wanted a new life, so he took mine. He didn't crash the car that night, he left me there. He made sure no one would find me until it was too late." My heart raced. Could it be true? Had my grandfather been responsible for her death? Before I could process her words, the air shifted again. The temperature dropped even further, and I heard footsteps, slow, deliberate, coming from behind me. I turned, and there he was. Not an apparition, but something darker. My grandfather, or rather, the twisted shadow of him. His eyes glowed the same hateful red as Lillian's. "She's lying," his voice boomed, shaking the walls of the cabin. I did what I had to do. She was dangerous. She would have ruined everything. I saved us. I stood frozen between them, their voices clashing in the air like thunder. The cabin felt like it was closing in on me. Two spirits locked in eternal conflict, both trapped by their own bitterness and betrayal. But there was something Lillian had said that stuck with me. "Lillian, you said you were left to die. Does that mean you never truly died in that crash?" She looked at me, her eyes softening for the first time. "No. I was still alive when he left me. That's why I can't leave. That's why I'm stuck here." Her words echoed in my mind. A life, half taken, trapped in the limbo between worlds. Suddenly, it all made sense. She wasn't haunting the cabin out of vengeance, she was stuck here, tethered to the moment of her betrayal. I turned to my grandfather's shadow. "You didn't just take her life, did you? You condemned her soul." His face twisted with guilt and rage, but he said nothing. I faced Lillian, my heart pounding. "If you never died, then maybe you need closure. Maybe that's the only way to free you." She stared at me, hope flickering behind her hatred. "How?" "I don't know," I admitted. "But I'm willing to help you find out." Suddenly, the air grew still. The oppressive energy lifted slightly, and the hateful glow in her eyes dimmed. She reached out a hand, almost touching mine, before whispering, "Find my grave." With that, she vanished, leaving me alone in the silence of the cabin. I knew what I had to do. The next morning, I ventured into the woods, retracing the path to the spot where Lillian had been buried. It took hours, but I found it, a crude, unmarked grave, hidden beneath years of fallen leaves. I stood there, feeling the weight of her tragedy, and spoke softly. "Lillian, I'm sorry for what happened to you. I don't know if this will be enough, but I hope you find peace." I marked the grave properly and whispered a prayer, asking for her spirit to finally be set free. As I walked back to the cabin, I felt it, a lightness in the air, the sense that something had finally lifted. When I reached the porch, I looked back one last time, knowing I would never return. The cabin wasn't haunted anymore. The truth had set both of us free. The Unwanted Roommates, Part 1. My name is Sheila, and what I'm about to tell you happened over 13 years ago. It all started when I moved to a new town, chasing a promising job opportunity. I didn't have much money, so I needed a cheap place to stay. After searching online, I found what seemed like a perfect apartment, spacious, furnished, and shockingly affordable. There was no lease required, and the landlord only asked for rent in cash. It all felt like an incredible deal, too good to pass up. The very next day, I moved in. The apartment looked exactly as advertised, clean, cozy, and welcoming. My neighbors were friendly, and everything seemed to fall into place. I felt lucky, excited to begin this new chapter. But that excitement didn't last long. That first night, I struggled to sleep. Strange noises echoed through the walls, scratching, tapping, and whispering. At first, I convinced myself it was just the building settling, or maybe the wind outside. But the noises grew louder, more insistent, until they were impossible to ignore. I turned on the lights, hoping to catch whatever was causing them, but as soon as I did, the apartment fell dead silent. The next night, it happened again. The moment I turned off the lights, the noises returned, scratches that felt too deliberate, whispers too human. When I turned the lights back on, everything stopped. Fear crept in, but I told myself it was all in my head. Still, the unease gnawed at me. I decided to call the landlord, hoping he could offer some explanation. When he picked up, there was a long pause after I told him about the sounds. His voice dropped, and he quietly said, "Oh, so you've heard them too?" My blood ran cold. "What do you mean?" I asked. With a heavy sigh, he told me something that made my heart stop. Years ago, a young woman lived in that very apartment. She had been brutally murdered by her boyfriend, stabbed to death in the bedroom. The boyfriend, consumed by madness, had taken his own life afterward. The police called it a crime of passion, the landlord said, but others, they say it was something darker, something evil. I was speechless. My mind raced. "Why didn't you tell me this before I moved in?" I demanded, furious and terrified. He stammered out an apology, admitting that he needed the money and hoped the spirits would leave me alone. "I thought maybe you could handle it," he added, as if that made it better. I hung up, my hands shaking with fear and anger. I had to leave. Now. I grabbed my suitcase and rushed to the door, but before I could turn the knob, the noises returned, louder and more violent than ever. The walls reverberated with screams, laughter, and cries. In the chaos, I heard the unmistakable sound of metal scraping against metal, like a knife being dragged across the floor. The air was thick with dread, the room pulsing with something malicious, something desperate. Adrenaline surged through me. I wrenched the door open and bolted down the stairs, my heart pounding in my ears. I didn't care if anyone saw me running like a madwoman, I just needed to get away. I burst onto the street, flagged down the first cab I saw, and told the driver to take me anywhere but there. I spent that night in a dingy motel room, unable to sleep. The sounds from the apartment haunted me, replaying in my mind over and over. I couldn't shake the feeling that the spirits weren't just confined to that apartment. I wondered if they would follow me, if I had somehow become entangled in their torment. The next morning, I called the landlord one last time. I demanded my money back and told him I was never returning to that cursed apartment. He sounded relieved, guilty even, as if he had been waiting for this call. He apologized again and promised to refund my rent, begging me not to tell anyone about what happened. I agreed, hung up, and packed my bags. I left that town behind, catching the first flight back to my hometown. I tried to start over, to forget what happened in that apartment. But those nights, those voices, the terror, I could never forget them. And, truth be told, I never really escaped. Last ride. My name is Bob, and I'm a part-time cab driver in a small, quiet town. It's a pretty simple gig, driving through the evening into late night, picking up a little extra cash. Over the years, I've encountered my fair share of odd passengers, but nothing, and I mean nothing, could have prepared me for what happened last night. It was just past midnight, and I was cruising down a desolate stretch of road, hoping to catch one last fare before heading home. That's when I saw him, standing alone by the side of the road, his hand raised, flagging me down. He looked ordinary enough, so I pulled over. "Where to?" I asked as he slid into the back seat. "Just drive," he replied in a flat, hollow voice. "I'll tell you when to stop." I hesitated for a second, but then shrugged and started the meter. He was dressed in a long, dark coat, and a hat that cast a shadow over his face. Something about him felt off, but I didn't press it. I'm not one for small talk, and he clearly wasn't either. We drove in silence for the next half hour, the road winding through dense woods and fields, with nothing but darkness ahead. I noticed him glancing out the window constantly, his eyes darting through the trees as if searching for something, or someone. His hands fidgeted in his lap, betraying his nerves. Finally, he spoke. "Stop here." I looked around. We were in the middle of nowhere, no houses, no streetlights, just a thick wall of trees and an unsettling quiet. "Are you sure?" I asked, uneasy. "Yes. This is the place." I glanced at the meter. "That'll be $25. Without a word, he reached into his coat and handed me $100 bill. "Keep the change," he muttered before stepping out of the car and disappearing into the woods. I watched him vanish into the darkness, feeling a growing sense of dread. Something wasn't right. And then I heard it, a scream, slicing through the silence. A scream that curdled my blood and sent a cold chill through my body. It was filled with terror, raw and primal. I froze, gripping the steering wheel, my mind racing. What the hell was going on? Was he in danger? Should I call the cops? But before I could make a decision, I heard it again, closer this time. The scream was his. I instinctively looked into the rearview mirror, and my heart nearly stopped. He was running toward the car, his face twisted in pure horror. Blood smeared his clothes, and in his hand, he clutched a knife. Panic surged through me. What had happened to him? And worse, what was following him? As he neared the car, his screams turned to frantic, desperate pleas. "Stop! Help me! Please!" But before I could react, I saw it. Something was moving in the darkness behind him. It was huge, unnaturally fast, and it wasn't human. Terror gripped me. My instincts screamed at me to get out of there, now. I slammed my foot on the gas, the engine roaring to life as I sped away. I didn't look back, but in the rearview mirror, I saw the thing, whatever it was, closing the distance between itself and the man with terrifying speed. Then, In a single horrifying moment, it caught him. I watched in disbelief as it yanked him back into the woods, his screams fading into the night. The knife he had been holding clattered to the ground as the darkness swallowed him whole. I drove like a madman, not stopping until I reached the safety of the town's gas station. My hands were shaking uncontrollably as I stumbled out of the car, drenched in cold sweat. I couldn't believe what I had just witnessed. I didn't want to believe it. Breathing heavily, I pulled the crumpled $100 bill from my pocket, the one he had given me before he walked into the woods. It hit me then, like a punch to the gut. He had paid me to drive him to his death. He knew what was waiting for him out there. He knew, and he still went. But why? What was his story? What was that thing lurking in the woods, waiting for him? I'll never know, and frankly, I don't want to. I don't want to think about it, dream about it, or even remember it. All I know is, after that night, I've had enough. No more late-night drives. No more unknown passengers. I don't want to be a cab driver anymore.